looking at the split brain research, I certainly found it fascinating that the current sort of paradigm seems to be the left hemisphere has evolved quite specialized abilities and traits in relatively recent times, and yet when you stand back and look at some of these traits, they seem to include traits that actually are quite severe pathologies. Things like self-deception, delusion, denial, confabulation, this sort of low-level constant lying, making up stories to make things fit the kind of beliefs and ideas we already have. Sometimes it's conscious, often it's subconscious, we don't even know we're doing it, so it's kind of like we're lying, or the left hemisphere is lying and is unaware it's lying. There's also a term thrown around, anosognosia. It's kind of a way of saying that we, or the left hemisphere, is generally unable or is unaware of its deficiencies. This is always highlighted in extreme examples, yet these traits exist in all of us. We're just not generally aware of them because our normal reference points, you know, those traits exist already. So we're all, by degrees, deceiving ourselves. There's low-level denial, lying, making up stories. We're generally not aware that that condition even exists, yet it's in the data and it's very clear. The explanation for some of these traits, for example, self-deception, it's somehow a useful trait. And as far as I'm aware, there are even PhD papers written trying to explain why we would have evolved this capacity for self-deception. That's all great if that's exactly what happened, but of course trying to figure out what's going on under the presumption of specialized traits. Well, the idea of specialized traits has come from the left hemisphere. It's looking at these traits and going, oh, these are specialized abilities. There's a very dangerous loop there, when in fact these traits are equally described as pathologies in certain circumstances. So generically we have these traits. Sometimes we call them pathologies, sometimes we call them specialized abilities. Which is it? I tend to lean towards the idea that our dominant hemisphere has a lot of pathology, but it's running the show and giving itself a clean bill of health, which is what we do when we're mentally ill. We're just not aware and we tend to think everything's okay. So I would always suggest look at the data, but don't buy into the conclusions, because by definition they're left brain or rational conclusions. The data I think is fascinating. The conclusions highly suspect, or at least we should be very cautious about looking at the conclusions, and at least there should be no fear and no risk of testing the idea whether there's an inherent pathology here. If there isn't, we give ourselves a clean bill of health. There should be no fear. If there is, we certainly need to know about it and make some decisions based on that information. But we should certainly be looking and asking that question. It's a very sensible, healthy thing to do. And we're not doing that, certainly not in the modern sort of scientific tradition. The presumption has been our neural system works. That's a built-in assumption. How does it work? We should really be asking whether it works in the first place. And I find it particularly intriguing that we have this ancient tradition that talks about some of these traits quite specifically. A lot of talk of delusion, and we find in the modern literature delusion, really good correlation. Is it one and the same thing? It's not definite proof, but it's fascinating it exists. So I'd invite anybody to look at this data, be wary of the conclusions of the authors. Remember, they have a left hemisphere, so they're writing about their own left hemisphere. Then they're interpreting the data, writing these conclusions without any respect to the very data they're writing about.